Hi, everybody, and welcome to the video and live streaming show. My name's John Lacey, and as always, I'm joined by Sam Proof. On today's show, we're going to navigate some of the many podcasting options there are out for you these days. So if you are thinking about starting a podcast in 2024, if you want to think about how you might create some episodic content, if you wonder if you should even be using the word podcast, we're going to unpack all of that today. So Sam, welcome. How has your week been? I know you got up to some very exciting things during the week.
Yeah, it's been an interesting week. Amanda was homesick until today, so she was home for 4 days, meaning I was like double duty parent, doing like all the runs with the kids and stuff, and trying to do other stuff, and that was something. And then yesterday, I got to sit down with Rob Greenlee over on the StreamYard podcast. Possibly a podcast, I would say, because I don't think he actually puts it out anywhere other than YouTube at this time. So a long-winded chat.
No, actually, he
does he?
Sorry to correct you, but he does actually do that as an audio podcast as well. So if you did miss it, you can watch it or you can listen to it later on. So
I thought he said he hadn't started that yet. Okay,
yeah.
Because I was
No,
like, I thought it was.
It's definitely
My
well.
bad,
I guess
bad.
the thing is, it's live on YouTube. I think it'll
Yeah.
probably take a few days for it to get to the audio world. But yes,
Nice.
that was very exciting that you got to hang out
Yeah.
with him and sort of reflect on in some ways, some very similar YouTube experiences. Even though you're predominantly a video guy and he's more of an audio guy. But again,
Yeah.
it's probably great background for the conversation we'll be having today.
Definitely.
So
I think it leads right in. Yeah. It's interesting because he comes from that podcast world and I come from the live stream world, and where we diverge, or where our Venn diagram exists was a good conversation. So what's up with you?
It's again, same old. I haven't been able to do as much as I wanted this week, which is kind of the story of my life, but I'm hoping to get a few more things done this weekend. But let's just check in with the chat. And if you are watching live, hashtag Team Live is always appreciated. Hello to Saeed, the facilitator over on YouTube, watching from Germany, where he's on Team Tired. And I should mention too that Saeed actually was on his first YouTube live events in the last week. And that was really cool to check out. I watched that one yesterday. And hello to CG, who's joining us over on Twitch as well. So it's great to have your company today. I guess, this is potentially a very, very big topic, and we're going to do our best to sort of unpack it. But as we get started today, I kind of want to just be really honest and open about this. You've got a lot of choices, but there are no right or wrong answers. It really depends on what's going to work for you and what's going to work for your audience. So I know there are a lot of hot, spicy takes online about it's not a podcast unless it does X, Y, and Z. And if you feel that way, that's fine. I don't think it's really that useful to worry about that, but just be aware that there are people who have been doing podcasting since 2005, and they're very set in their ways, and they might be a bit confronted by some of the newer options. But really, I think it all comes down to what works for you. And Sam, you were reflecting on that conversation you had with Rob Greenlee in terms of the convergence of all these mediums. So how do you think we should sort of think about these things moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I said on his show, and I've said this time and time again, is know what your main product is, right? Are you an audio podcast first and foremost, or are you an interactive live stream? If you're going to do this as a live stream and turn it into a podcast, is the podcast the product, or is the live stream the product? Because it can't be both. They take different requirements, right? Like, you can do them both together, but to put the best effort, your best foot forward and make one product the best, you really have to establish, is this going to be what happens at the very end, or is it the thing that I take from, I put out there live on the internet? Because you're going to do different things with that. If you're going for that audio or even video podcast after the fact, then you may approach the live stream differently. And if you're going for the live stream first, you may, you're going to put more effort on utilizing the interaction between your audience. Either way, you're going to use it. But for a live, experience, you really have to stay on top of that chat. You really have to be able to keep an eye on it, answer all the questions, make everyone who shows up feel that it was worth their time to show up live. Whereas with, the audio version, you can sort of pick and choose what are the best possible questions for me to take on. You may even be like, hey, we're going to do 10 minutes of this segment and then I'll answer questions, just because you may need to do that for an audio podcast. So there's a lot of things I think to sit down with and, decide before you approach this.
And I guess the thing I kind of alluded to earlier was that in some ways there is this convergence, and it probably doesn't matter too much what words you use, but what does kind of matter is that people identify in different ways, and some people identify as podcasters, and some people identify as YouTubers and live streamers and video makers, and those identities run really, really deep. And I think in some ways and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but I just want people to not get too hung up on those identities and just think about what is the best way to share your information, especially if you're giving it away for free, with your audience. Right. And just be aware that everybody has their own consumption preferences. And even as somebody who loves sort of videos and live streams, the truth is I listen to so many more audio podcasts for the simple reason that I can multitask while I listen to them.
Yeah.
So in some ways, and we'll talk about this in a later segment, but in some ways, to the extent that you're able to give people different options, I would encourage you to probably do that. But I guess the other thing too is that, and I completely lost my track of thought on that one. But I guess the thing is, people have these preferences. We want to give them options. We don't want to constrain them too much. And I think that's something I talk about on Build a Presentation Muscle, my audio podcast, which we'll sort of talk about later as well as a bit of an example. But it is important, though, in the sense that people need to know where to find your content and how to enjoy it. So I guess that's the thing. If they need to go to a specific website, if they need a special app, if they need to register and sign up, just let them know where it is, how often they can expect it. And, that way you can actually become a part of your audience's, weekly routine. So that in itself is incredibly useful. I'm just going to go to this comment from Saeed. So he's wondering, would this show also work as a podcast? I mean, repurposing. And we were going to get to this a little bit later, but I think, Sam, you might as well speak to this. So we don't really advertise this very much, but Sam does take this podcast as a video and does a certain thing with it. So tell us about that, Sam.
Yeah, so we do turn this into a podcast. We trim off the tops and the bottoms, and we put it out there through Spotify, and it goes to all the podcast places. So you can actually listen to this after the fact. It's both a video and audio podcast that is available. I don't at this point put a lot of effort into editing it down and removing the ums and ahs and all of that stuff. So I look at this as a live stream first, and the podcast is really more of a, here's what you missed, but come join us live.
Absolutely. And I must admit, I mean, I don't listen to it because I'm on it, and I kind of remember what happens for the most part. Right. But again, I'm always conscious that it's there, and we could go back to it and listen to it in that way. So again, that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of giving your audience options, though, because, and to be really honest with you, I used to. And I think it's still true to some extent, but I used to sort of explore the philosophical differences between content types. And I would say, if you're going live, you are there for your audience, and that's the most important thing. And video is different to audio. But I think in some ways, if I can listen to something, I can usually pick up on most of the cues, and I can actually go back to the original video if I need a little bit more information. And that's sort of, the ability to do that means I'm untethered from my desk or, wherever I happen to be watching the video, and I can sort of go and work on other things. So there are obviously, there are different, you could potentially have different goals for your content. You might want to push people to specific platforms. But again, I think in some ways, if you're just building relationships, it can help if you meet people where they already live.
Yeah. I think it's a good point that you made about, listening to podcasts, like when you're on a commute and stuff like that, where you're not actually visually paying attention to something, or you wouldn't have that ability. And I think that still does apply to a lot of live streams. Like if you're doing something like we're doing, even when we do a tutorial or screen share something, it's really important to keep in mind those viewers that are not, going to be paying attention. Some people will sit back and put us on just as noise, insomnia doodles, and walk around and do their thing. So when you do get to that sort of instructional thing, especially when it's a screen share, make sure that you're presenting that information in, a step-by-step way that makes sense to someone who's not looking at the screen.
Absolutely, and there's sort of a accessibility dimension to that as well, because even if someone is,
Yes.
playing your video, doesn't mean they can necessarily see it, and it's much better to say go to the file menu rather than click here, because if they can't see where you're clicking, that means nothing at all. And that in itself is a skill that you probably will need to learn and practice and get better with over time. But it's quite useful to be quite deliberate with your word choice, I think. Say it is written, as a consumer, I like podcasts that also have a video version. I listen to most of the podcasts on YouTube. And this is really interesting because the people that listen to audio podcasts don't really believe that people watch video podcasts and vice versa. Like we're so stuck in our own experience that it's often difficult to realize that other people want other things. And I think it's really worth articulating from time to time. But I guess in some ways, the ability to go live on different social media platforms, different video platforms, that kind of has some implications in terms of your costs. So, if you're uploading to YouTube or you're going live on YouTube, there's not necessarily a price attached to that in a way that there might be if you were using a traditional audio podcasting host, which often have sort of monthly fees. But I guess the other thing too, no matter what you end up making, it's going to require a lot of work. And and in a lot of ways, I see marketers on the internet say, it's really easy, press these 3 buttons and you'll be famous by next week. And it doesn't work that way. I'm sorry to be a downer, but it is true. And for that reason, I encourage you to also think about what are your content creation preferences. So if you absolutely can't stand the thought of looking at a camera, then you can either work on getting more comfortable with that, or you can just take the camera out of the equation entirely. So, in some ways, I encourage people to, if there's too much resistance towards something, then that's going to be such a stumbling block that will encourage you to fail and give up really, really quickly. And no matter what you're creating, in some ways, I think the goal is just to hang around long enough to make an impact.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's only so much time and energy in the day. So, if you've got something that's a block, avoid it. Like, don't worry about that. Maybe in time you'll come to like it, but yeah, just take out all the unnecessary steps you need to get the thing done, which again is why you want to prioritize what is the product.
Yes. And in some ways you can repurpose, you can recycle, you can cross-post, but think about, what is the most important thing? Like if you can only get one thing done this week, what would it be? What would that look like? And, I think that's worthwhile. And just take a really long-term approach with a lot of these things because I know some people, even some people in our audience have huge followings on certain platforms, of which I'm ever so slightly jealous. But if you're not in that situation, you really do need to spend a fair bit of time doing the outreach, creating the content, sharing around, promoting it quite well. So keep all that in mind, but we're going to unpack some of the options that you have today. Are you going to do it live? Are you going to pre-record? Are you going to do audio only or video? We're going to edit it, or we're just going to release it uncut and raw and real. Those are some of the things that we're going to cover on today's show. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back in a second.
We are constantly training our cats, every interaction that we have with them. Mm-hmm. So when Johan would get on my counter before, this is 10 years ago, before I was the cat expert that I am now, Johan would jump on the counter. What was the first thing I did? I'd say his name, Johan. He loves that. That's a reward for him. He said, you just said my name. I would go over to him and I'd talk to him and be like, you can't be on the counter. Johan loves when I talk to him. Ding, that's another reward for Johan. I'd pick him up and put him on the ground, but I didn't want him to think I was mad at him. So when I'd pick him up very nicely and kiss him on the head and say, I love you, but you can't be here. I'd put him on the ground. I had just done 3 things that rewarded him for being on the counter. So I was encouraging him to continue doing that.
And that's a segment from Sam's podcast, Just Kitten Around, which you can learn more about over at cuteavalanche.com. And of course, they've got the kitten cam there as well. So if you need that cuteness in your life, that's definitely the place to head. Okay, this is the video and live streaming show. Today, we're talking all about unpacking the many, many options that you have in terms of podcasts or shows or episodic content, however we want to describe that. And I guess in some ways, the first place I think we should start is talking in terms of doing it live or pre-recording. So, Sam, you've obviously had a lot of experience going live. What do you think some of the benefits of going live actually are?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing live streaming since 2005, so it's almost coming up on, what is the math, 20 years there. I think the real benefit of doing something live is having that audience interaction. You know, assuming you have an audience that is active, you can get some really good questions for them. If you're doing some sort of like guest kind of interview or you know, whatever, that'll bring up talking points where if you have stalled in your own preparation or something like that, you've got that to fall back on. And just, there is nothing better to giving you what your audience wants than their own questions, right? Like, you don't have to guess. There's no guesswork there. That's what they want to know. There it is. So I think that is, you know, first and foremost, the biggest benefit to it. I like the ability with live streaming to do, you know, live cutting, live editing, so that there's a reduction of whatever happens after the show. I don't have to worry about as much post-production, that kind of thing. And, you know, there's a multitude of different platforms you can hit doing a live stream, whereas the podcast will go to its own different platforms. But like, you know, being able to hit things like Twitch and YouTube and to some extent, you know, X and whatever else is out there, I think is great. And that's, you know, just widens that net.
Sure. I guess the flip side of that, though, is that sometimes the audience will want to take the conversation in places you don't necessarily want to go. And you do need to be a little bit conscious about how you manage that, because, and I'm sure there have been times even on this show where someone has come in with the most random, obscure question about some piece of software that we haven't heard of in 20 years.
Yeah.
And we go, hey, and sometimes, you know, that's what you got to do is just say, hey, we don't know the answer to that one. You might want to do some research online. Sometimes we'll take the question on board and sort of attempt to answer it after the show. But it is important. And I think sometimes, again, coming back to that idea of knowing the final product up front, if you are looking to produce something that is incredibly edited and concise and direct and to the point, you probably don't want all the banter between you and the chatters in that. And you could do that in sort of an editing situation, but it could be, and again, like if you are looking to repurpose, it could be a question of, I'm going to cover the content now, and then I'm going to answer the questions in a moment, and then just continue that process throughout the entire show, like whatever that needs to look like. I think in some ways, and Michelle J. Raymond's is a classic example of this, like she loves going live because she, you know, it's often, and I'm sometimes guilty of this as well, but sometimes if you are recording offline, you can do a million takes and not be happy and never release anything.
Yes.
And in some ways, the live thing forces you to just accept whatever happens. And if you stumble over your words, your audience is probably much more forgiving of that than you are as a self-conscious person talking on camera. So I think in some ways that can be quite useful as well. So if you are prone to that kind of perfectionism, that's certainly something to keep in mind. I guess the thing that I, and this is something that makes sense to me, and I don't know that it necessarily makes sense to other people, but let me tell you about it. I'm a big fan of thinking about a subject for a week going live and then also doing some edited content at the same time while it's fresh in my mind. Whether those things go out at the same time or different times is a whole other question. But in some ways, I think while your mind is processing that subject matter, it's a really great opportunity to create a number of different pieces of content. And again, it could just be a matter of recording those at that time and maybe editing them or publishing them later on. But I think in some ways, and in part because, you know, things will go wrong and sometimes you just have to redo something. But I think that's a really, really important skill, is the ability to give that same presentation again. And again, if you're going to speak to different groups, you know, you're not starting from scratch every single time. You want to think about what you're actually presenting. Let's talk about recorded content. And I know, I get the feeling outside of sort of standalone videos and shorts and that kind of thing, you probably don't do a lot of that. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Currently, yeah, that's pretty accurate.
I must admit, it is a very different mindset when I find I'm recording a tutorial or something offline. And in some ways, you know, getting back to that perfectionism thing, if I have to go live at a certain time, it almost doesn't matter how prepared I feel. I've just got to turn on the camera and hit the button and do the thing. And if it's not perfect, it's not perfect. Whereas, you know, I can procrastinate so hard on recording something locally. But I guess the flip side of that is, if I am recording, like my audio podcast, for example, that's completely offline, that's completely local. And I don't have, because it is audio only, I don't have to worry about what I look like. I don't worry if I'm talking expressively with my hands in a way that I would feel really self-conscious about if I did it on camera. I don't think Sam has that same problem because he's forever smacking his microphone arm around. So
I think I would still do that in an audio podcast. So it would just be like, well, what was that noise? At least this way you see it.
Yes.
But yeah, I think having the constraint of live makes my perfectionism take a sidestep to like, it's just going to be what it is. We're going to do the thing. Like, how bad could it get? If it gets that bad, we just don't point anyone to it.
Sure. And I guess the other thing I want to sort of mention is that you can record stuff and then bring that recorded stuff into your live events. And not only is that a great opportunity to demonstrate software or to show concepts or, you know, show things in their real context, but it's also a great opportunity for you to catch your breath and have a sip of water. And, you know, I've mentioned in past shows, that's kind of why we do those promos in between these segments, because it gives me a couple of minutes to switch between different backgrounds and get ready with the banners and that kind of thing. So again, you know, I see a lot of people with these be right back sequences, and those are great. But if you kind of know that you're going to need a moment in 5 or 10 minutes time, if you can sort of think about that ahead of time, that can be quite useful.
Yeah, the viewer experience on having some, like a clip or a bunch of clips to watch versus just like the empty gaming chair with a BRB screen above it is a big difference. Like, you know, give them something to entertain. Like, use that time wisely.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is the video and live streaming show. Today we're talking all about unpacking the podcasting options, the show options that you have available to you. And I have heard a little bit of a rumor that somebody in our audience might be starting a podcast. So I'm curious to see if we can get a response out of that person, but we'll see how we go. We're going to come back and talk about, you know, some of the video versus audio options that we have available and how you might want to think about working with those.
And then I looked at the first assessment, and the first assessment was record a 5-minute video, and it was a pretty simple introduction of yourself. There was nothing exciting. I didn't have to research. It was just a 5-minute warm-up, and I freaked out. That course is still sitting in the cupboard beside me. I see that stack of papers and I almost rock in the corner. It cost me a lot of money to sign up, and I threw the whole course away.
And that's Michelle J. Raymond speaking on my podcast, Build a Presentation Muscle, and she's very candid there about how difficult it was for her to overcome her fear of being on camera. And again, like, she's literally just spoken at Social Media Marketing World in San Francisco. Yeah. So clearly it is something that you can overcome. So that's really awesome. Okay, so today on the show we're talking and you can learn more about that over at johnlacey.com, but today on the show we're talking about unpacking some of the podcasting options we have, and I think we need to talk about audio versus video. And again, this is something lots of people have feelings about, and again, I don't want you to get too tied up with any notion that you've heard from anybody online. First and foremost, do what you're comfortable with, do what you want to do. If you don't have a boss or a sponsor telling you have to do a certain thing, it's kind of up to you. Make sure you respect those laws and copyrights and terms and conditions, but otherwise, it is pretty open. So I guess, like Sam, you do almost I think practically exclusively a video. So maybe let's start there. What do you think people gain by being on video and showing up on camera?
Yeah, I think there's just a bigger connection happening for your viewer. Like, they see the face and there's just a human connection to be made there. I mean, maybe some people have very nice voices, but I think first and foremost, people are going to look for eyes and get into that. So it could, who knows, that could be a good and a bad thing. I don't know. But yeah, I think having that there is an instant connector. Also with video, especially like sites like YouTube, your discoverability is a lot higher in a lot of ways than a typical podcast. Like you're going to rank higher in Google searches and stuff. I think Spotify's pretty good, but typically the YouTube will start to rank higher because it's a Google product. And also people will use YouTube itself as a search engine. So you're really being searched for in two different search engines that are the top two search engines, as opposed to if you just put out the audio podcast, you're only going to rank in Google and whatever else. So I think those are some pretty big, starting points on that. Also video just gives you the ability to do a lot more things like, screen sharing and product demos and like having that visual reference of whatever the thing is. So you can be a little lazier in your verbiage if you need to be, but it's just a different opportunity.
Sure. And I must admit, even as somebody that listens to a lot of audio podcasts, my brain wants to paint a picture of the person I'm listening to, and it's kind of hilarious and often people will have a picture of themselves on their podcast artwork, but often that's really tiny in an app. And my brain will just invent what I think this person looks like, and eventually I'll see them and realize it looks nothing like what I imagined. So in some ways, I almost encourage you, even if you are doing the audio thing, make sure that people can actually see you somewhere to get a better sense of who you are, that they don't invent too much on their behalf. But I mean, in some ways, and this is, I guess, potentially true of both video and audio, but if people are listening to you with headphones, that's a very intimate experience. You're sort of speaking directly into their ear. I guess in some ways, Sam spoke about prioritizing for the particular products that you are basically building towards. And I guess for me, as much as I appreciate that this show goes out as a video you can watch on Spotify or as audio that you can listen to on most other platforms, I can be a bit of an audio snob at times, and I'm kind of, in some ways, if I turn the video off, I can just focus on the audio. I can just think about the normalization and the compression and the effects and the timing and that kind of thing. And I think, the thing that my friend Josh Liston would say if he was here, and he never is, but I invite him every week. But he's an audio podcast creator and editor, and he has a business that offers those services. And I think in some ways, he would promote the idea that this is very much an art form, and you're sort of painting a picture, even if it's something that people might need to imagine inside of their heads rather than literally see. So I think that's really worthwhile to consider as well. I did kind of already mention this, but I think it's worth mentioning again. If I'm just recording audio, I don't need to worry about what I look like, and that is such a stumbling block for so many people. And I as much as I don't want to acknowledge this, there will be people on the internet that will judge you, and on YouTube, you might get some negative feedback based on nothing but what you look like. And that's something that I think you need to develop a thick skin just to push through and keep going. So
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So again, and I think in some ways, like, don't like start wherever you are, like start with whatever you're comfortable with. You can always build up on that. And the thing that I did recommend on Build a Presentation Muscle is start recording yourself on camera as soon as possible. Not with the intention of actually releasing that, but just for you to watch back. So if you're recording an audio podcast, you can watch it back. Again, it's going to be difficult to listen and see yourself for the first time, and maybe several times just to get used to that experience. But the great thing is, over a certain amount of time, you will discover you actually sound and look better on camera than you think, and you make some really compelling points. And you will have those recordings, and then you'll go, hey, I can make something with that. So it's much better to capture these things, whether you want to use them or not. Just be mindful of the fact that they do require storage space. So get some of those back up drives. Sayed had a great comment earlier, which I'll come back to in the last segment, but I just want to read this one. When I close my eyes, 90% of my training and event recordings already sound like a podcast, so I'm at least considering it. And I guess that's the thing, and we kind of alluded to this, but Spotify for Podcasters, which was formerly known as Anchor FM, does give you the ability to create an account for free. It does give you the ability to upload a video, and people can watch that video on Spotify, or they can listen to the audio in more traditional podcasting apps and destinations. Yep. In some ways, that's wonderful, and especially if you don't have a budget, free is great, although you will find at some point, if you are using it for a business, there will be some constraints. And we have actually heard just in the last week that somebody's account was compromised, things were deleted, all their subscribers are just gone forever. So in some ways, it might be better to pay for that and run with it. But admittedly, I feel like, Sam, both of your podcasts are on that system, and you haven't had any problems.
They are.
As far as I know.
We haven't had any issues with it, but yeah, they do exist on that. And it's just so much easier. I have done like some pretty convoluted things to create the audio RSS feed that a podcast requires, because I didn't have, I didn't want to put the money into the Podbean or Listbin or any of those things. And so I've done some of those, like you host everything on the archive.org site, turn it into like a Tumblr, and there you've created an RSS feed that then you put into like FeedBurner, and then FeedBurner you throw into every existing podcast thing. And that podcast is still out there and perfectly safe. But boy, was that a pain in the butt.
Yeah. I mean, there are other ways of doing that. And again, like if it really depends on how popular your podcast is as to whether that's sustainable or not, because you can throw it up on like a WordPress site. There is the PowerPress plugin that will help you create those RSS feeds and things too. But the thing is, if Oprah mentions your podcast and you suddenly get 1 billion downloads overnight,
you can't
that'll
handle
probably
the traffic.
Wipe everything out, and you'll get a very expensive bill from your hosting company. Right. So, you do need to think about those things a little bit. So keep that in mind. And again, there's a whole bunch of admiration for different voices in the chat. Business Growth Ready is talking about James Earl Jones, and Said mentioned Morgan Freeman.
Yep.
He was so popularly the voice of God in so many popular culture things.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And again, I didn't even think to mention this, but Said brought it up. We have spoken about it on previous shows. So YouTube has its own little podcasting functionality these days, and I guess the main reason it exists is because YouTube Music it does have some podcasting options in there. So essentially, you can upload videos. So I guess this is an alternative to sort of the Spotify for Podcasters option. You can upload videos, whether it's an actual video with you talking and moving, whether it's just a static image with some audio behind it. And you can actually create a new playlist, specify that playlist as a podcast. And that way, people who can use the YouTube Music app can find it and listen to it in that way. It is kind of curious because I think they still play as videos even in the YouTube Music app, which...
Yeah. as far
kind of
as I
makes me wonder
understand, yeah.
why you need the YouTube Music app in addition to the YouTube app.
Right,
But that's
right.
that's a whole other conversation.
They have a bunch of those spin-off apps where I'm like, but is that a necessary thing? Because I don't want to put that on my
Yes.
phone.
And I guess the other thing too that might be worth mentioning at this point is that Google did have their own Google Podcasts app, which is still out and about at the moment, but will be closed down relatively soon. So
Yeah.
it's not a great app. I don't know why anybody would use it, but if you happen to be using it, please take some time to find a new app and subscribe to your favorite podcasts so you don't miss out on those in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I guess we've kind of addressed a number of these points. I'm just looking here. I guess the other thing, and this has absolutely nothing to do with anything, but I thought I'd mention it because it was kind of funny. It dawned on me recently that while I'm working, I have two monitors and my teleprompter. And it kind of dawned on me during the week that I could watch YouTube videos on the teleprompter while I'm working. So
Sure.
during the week, I sort of did this. There's Garen Belaney from Micro Studio. I watched him via the teleprompter. I actually watched Saeed's live stream that way as well too. So if you've got any devices, you can certainly set those up and listen to them in that way as well. But let's go to another promo. We'll be back in a second, and we'll talk about editing because this can be a surprisingly controversial subject. So just keep that in mind.
If you've been watching us for a while or this is your first time and you're thinking, Sam, John, this is great stuff, but I'm wearing a lot of hats already and I don't need to add this to my list of things that I'm doing, but I really want to live stream, I've got you covered. I've been a freelance technical director and stream operator for 20 years, and I can help you either with one-on-one counseling, setups of shows, or even run your whole show for you. Get in touch with me, samproof@gmail.com, or find out more at samproof.tv.
And of course, if you do need those production services, hit Sam up. He'd be happy to help you with that. I just want to go back to a comment from Saeed from earlier. So podcasts with guests are always nice, although some of them are just interviews and not conversations. So this is probably where Sam and I are going to vary a little bit, but I'm curious, Saeed, if you can maybe type in the chat what you think the distinction there is, because I guess in some ways, you have the interrogation approach, which is question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, and no follow-up questions as well, which I think is often a missed opportunity. But I guess on the other side of that spectrum, sometimes people just talk about whatever pops into their head and it's not necessarily relevant. And again, this is the part where I get a little bit frustrated because I feel really time poor and I kind of want you to stick to the topic. So how do you feel about that, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm somewhere in the middle of the whole thing where, I definitely have a structure, like topics that I want to hit when I bring someone on to talk to interview. But I like to, go where the conversation goes and take questions from the chat and things like that. So I definitely feel that I'm lean more into the conversational side. But at the same time, I think just my ADHD is like, at a certain point, I'm going to forget what the hell we were talking about. And it's just going to need to go where it goes.
And I guess that brings us into this discussion about whether you edit or whether you leave it uncut. And, you sort of mentioned that for the podcast version of this show, you take the beginning and the end off, but essentially the rest of it is all pretty much as was performed. I guess for me, and again, like this in some ways, I almost feel like this is a personality flaw on my behalf, but I don't want to hear a lot of random stuff. I really want you to be focused. And I know some people really struggle with that. And I just can't listen to them for any extended period of time. I'm like, please stick to the script. I guess I like things structured. And I impose a lot of structure on Sam in this show. And he's very gracious about it. But
I mean, I feel like having constraints is a benefit. Like anytime you establish these are the rules, then great. Otherwise I will go and do X, Y, and Z and be like, whatever, there's no rules. I could do everything. Candy for breakfast. So yeah, I like the limitations. I think that's fine.
And again, I kind of feel like if you're not going to edit after the recording, you kind of need to edit a little bit up front. And I think that's about putting some structure in place. Again, you know, I'm sure everyone in the audience understands these 4 segments we have on this show. And, you know, some weeks they're really deeply defined and other weeks we really just wing it. But, you know, I hear a lot of particularly audio podcasters that will literally just talk for an hour and then they'll cut it down to like 20 minutes. And I actually like editing, but I would find that incredibly frustrating. So when I create, especially if I'm making like a short video, like I script things out. I know the points I want to hit. And I don't want to do too many takes, because that was something that's always been very frustrating for me in the past, is like sometimes I will get so fed up trying to get the takes I want that by the end of them, you can see how angry I am. It's kind of hilarious. So, you know, often I will just, you know, I will have things written out. And I guess that was where the teleprompter first blew my mind, was that I had, you know, 2 or 3, I think it was probably only 1 or 2 minutes, but I literally did it in one take in real time. And it was great. And I know a lot of people have feelings about reading, and I'm going to talk about that on the podcast because it blows my mind how many people are anti-reading. And I think much of this comes from the fact that they can't read well out loud. And I think it really is a skill you probably should invest some time in. But just going back to the comments. So yeah, Said's saying, yes, interrogation is what I meant. It sounds very prepared and rehearsed. Also, if it is only about the guest, why should I listen to your podcast? What's your role as the host? This is a great question.
That's a good question. Yeah, for sure. You know, it's funny because I recently was the guest on 2 different podcasts that both had, I think, the far ends of these spectrums, whereas the Rob Greenlee one was very conversational, almost to a fault, where, you know, we just wandered wherever the chat went for the most part. There was a topic, but we definitely like had to reel it back every time. And then I was on the Affluencer podcast 2 weeks ago, and that one was almost like, here you go, Sam, here's a softball, you talk now. And I was like, that's fine for me, because I want to talk about myself. I came here to do that. But yeah, I could see that as like a listener, like, who cares? Like, what are you, the host, adding to this conversation? Nothing. No offense to Brett out there, but I do feel like those were very extremely different experiences. And I think that's, you know, something that is, as a host, as a producer of a podcast, something you really need to pay attention to and see, you know, A, what is it that your audience wants? And B, how do you or your host offer that, you know, like offer expertise on that subject, you know? And yeah, I think that's a really good point.
And I think that's like there is sort of just a networking dimension to interview shows, whether they're audio or video or both. So, I mean, it's great outreach, but I think a lot of the recommendations I've been hearing lately is that you kind of, especially if you're positioning yourself as the expert, you kind of want to have some solo content. You kind of want to talk about the things that you know, and that's not to say you can't supplement or you shouldn't supplement that with other experts in other areas. But it's just something to keep in mind, because in some ways there is that danger that you just become a professional interviewer, and that's what you're known for. And if you're not like a talk show host, then, you know, that could potentially be a problem. I guess the other thing, like Said comes, you know, his whole thing is, you know, we get together, we have a lot of fun. And especially in the business world, on the business platforms, people are a little bit scared of being, you know, carefree and saying the first thing that pops into their head, often for very good reasons. And there are situations where sometimes questions and answers have to go via legal before you can actually say them on a podcast.
That's true.
So it really does depend on what kind of content you've got, who your audience is, and who your guests are. So, I mean, there is that danger. And again, I don't listen to a lot of legal podcasts, but I'm certainly aware that is often a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would, you know, like with Cute Avalanche, we do chats, which are not the same as the podcast. These are just, we get on live stream and talk to the audience. And the amount of times that we have gotten a medical question where we have to be like, listen, we're not veterinarians. We cannot really give you an answer to this. You know, it's a lot, you know, like you don't want to take that risk as a host to like offer someone information where something bad could happen that is not the intended outcome. So yeah, you definitely have to be careful with things of that nature, and know what your limitations are.
And again, I think that's a great example for this conversation about editing, because sometimes, if you are recording offline, and I say offline, it literally just not live, just without an audience. So whether that's face to face or, via one of the very many remote tools we have these days, sometimes people will say things and they'll go, "Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that. Can you please take it out?" And you do have that opportunity when if they've just discovered it straight after the recording and you are editing, you can go in and do that. If you do it live, it's kind of too late.
Right.
There's a good chance people have seen it. They might have downloaded copies of it, depending on what it is and how salacious it might have been. So there is that opportunity. I think some of the other editing opportunities, and this is kind of true of video and audio, but there's great opportunities to take a story and tell it in different ways. And sometimes, if you're talking to a guest, you can ask them about their career and they'll give you this chronological thing. And, you might listen to that later and go, there are certain themes I really want to pick up on. So I'm going to start at, modern day career, and then we're going to do a bit of a flashback to the beginning of your career. As long as you're not sort of substantially changing the thing that person has said, that can be quite engaging. There's also the opportunity to take out the ums and ahs. Again, that's not something I particularly encourage people to become neurotic about, because I think to err is human.
Sure.
I don't have a problem with that, and I've just come to accept that for the most part. If I'm not reading from a script, I'm going to say and ah at some point. It's a given. And I think in some ways, just giving yourself grace to be okay with that is fine. And Saeed's got another comment here.
Sure.
And again, I feel like this almost comes back to the thing Sam was saying about being a little ADHD. Saeed has written, I watched a podcast on YouTube the other day. It had so many hard cuts that it made me dizzy. However, the audio itself sounded fine. Mm-hmm. So there is this school of thought that you have to change things on your screen every 3 seconds to keep people engaged. And I have no doubt that appeals to some people, but it doesn't appeal to me.
I think, it's the Mr. Beastification of video. Like, that is his thing. It is literally 3 to 6 seconds. He has a new cut, a new element, something's different on the screen. And I think that's fine if you're dealing with, a video that is 10 minutes or less, like a short video, even more so. But when you're dealing with an hour-long podcast, oh my God, yeah, that sounds like a nightmare to watch. I think take a cue from documentary filmmakers and go that route, where you have, a lot of slower cuts, like a lot longer. You don't have to go crazy with it, especially if you're doing this live. It's like, if you're one manning this operation, which I know so many of us are, you don't need to go crazy like that. John and I almost never cut away from ourselves. It's almost always two heads. Occasionally, we go to a solo on one person because probably the other person had to deal with something most of the time, and it's not a logical cut necessarily. And a live streaming audience doesn't care. We're here for the interaction. We don't care that, oh man, this has the most polished video production I've ever seen in the world. They would just go watch a Netflix show. So yeah,
and I guess,
think they can take it easy.
Yes. So I mean, do all things in moderation, but also if you're doing that for an hour, are you going to be making 600 cuts? Because that's potentially days of work, I would suggest, to be doing that if it's not happening automatically. But I guess the thing too is it is definitely possible to over edit. And we have a lot of tools these days, like Descript, for example, where you can edit via words rather than via waveforms. And you can go in and you can cut out every but both the audio and video are potentially going to be pretty jumpy if you do that. And I've actually been a guest on podcasts that have been edited in this fashion, and it's really weird for me to listen to the original recording and the edited recording because I do hear those jumps.
Right.
And I don't know if I would be as conscious of them if I hadn't have been the person having that conversation, but it is a little jarring to my ear. And I think in some ways I kind of want to prioritize the naturalness of the conversation over, the ums and the ahs. And I've already told you what I think of those.
Sure.
So just be mindful, because there are all kinds of tools, including the AI tools, which I don't want to mention, but maybe Sam will talk about, that'll do things. And the thing about AI, and I think more people are beginning to realize this, is you might need to do less work up front, but you probably have to do a lot more work afterwards to make sure that the thing that's been generated is good, it is correct, and it sounds or looks okay. And I think in some ways we're just moving the burden of effort from one place in the process to another. So I don't know if that's necessarily a great idea, but I'm kind of old enough that I'm so used to looking at waveforms that's how I prefer to edit audio. So I will just look at the waveform. And I know younger people don't understand that. If you haven't been doing that for 10, 15 years, you won't get it. You'll be like, why aren't you just deleting words out of here like a word processing application? But I kind of, I just, if you do that and you look at the waveform and it goes from nothing to a lot really quickly, then it's kind of jarring to my ear, at least.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I also cut by waveform. Like you could put my sine wave up there and I will be like, there's the ums right there. I know exactly what they look like. I spent a year like working a production company where all I did was audio video syncing, and I'm sadly good at that. But yeah, to speak to the AI side of things. So yeah, there are a bunch of programs out there that do, isolate all these things or clean up your audio or do X, Y, and Z. And some of them I think are useful to a point. I personally agree with John that like taking all those ums and ahs out, especially if you're doing a video, is unnecessary. If there's a really long pause in there, then by all means, go with those cuts. But I still think you do have to manually kind of look at that, unless you're just turning it into short clips. Then by all means, use those AIs to like find those breaking points. I still think there's a lot of improvement to come with those. Because for the most part, all they're doing is finding a sound bite and like, isolating the ins and outs. And that's really nothing, like it's not giving you a good hook. It makes discoverability of that not necessarily going to be great. So, it's okay, but could be so much better. There's a lot of tools out there that will clean up your audio. And I had this experience with, I believe it was the Adobe podcast product, where I thought this is just cleaning up my audio. But really what it was doing was feeding it into the AI. And then the AI was remastering what it thought you said in your voice. So it was completely redoing it. So when you have like a caption and that caption says the wrong word, this is what it was doing. And I was like, why? There's no way I would have said that. Like, what happened there? And it was like completely interpreted the word wrong. And I was like, so you got to be really careful with some of those right now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And it's funny, we talk about sort of automatic captioning sometimes getting things wrong, but a lot of these tools, they're brand new. They're proprietary. You don't have any insight into how they work, and sometimes you will find really weird things. And again, with that Adobe product, and it's been under a lot of development since I've used it, and I haven't used it in probably a year at this point. But essentially, like it would improve some things, and it would actually make things objectively worse for me. And I know there are some knobs and levels that you can adjust now to fix that, but again, I think whenever you use one of those tools, you do need to do that quality control. There's just no way around it. And if you don't, you probably will learn that the hard way. I guess the other thing too, I just wanted to mention, sometimes, like if you do have a cut, especially a video cut, that's a great place to put some sort of stinger or transition or B-roll footage over that to cover it. And I spoke to Michelle J. Raymond on her podcast some time ago, and I was just creating a short video clip to promote it. There was one moment when I was talking, but my camera, I think it was the cam link actually, just sort of glitched for like a second. So I didn't have any footage of me talking at that point. In that case, I kind of just put her on the screen as the reaction. But again, I think it's important just accept there will times you will want to do that for creative reasons, and there are times you will just have to because something went wrong.
Yes.
And that in itself is fine. But again, it's
Yep.
kind of the audio jumps that are quite disorientating for me as a listener. And that might not be true of everybody, but that's certainly where I am. Okay, let's have a look at this question. So, Saeed, do you have any general tips for the very first episode just to get started? So, I've kind of alluded to the fact, but rumor has it that Saeed is possibly starting a podcast this year. So, he was named. He was sort of shopping around some different names for it on the business platform that I refuse to name anymore. But again, I think it's really worthwhile to explore this. So, let me start with you, Sam. What advice would you have?
I mean, I would first sit down and just decide like what that is going to look like. Like, what's the end product? What's the result that we're looking for? Is this, an interview based podcast? Is this live stream, first? Is it audio first? Like what, once you have all of those things, I would be able to give better advice. But, I think, with Saeed, specifically, he's already got so much experience with OBS and live in general that I think my advice is don't over prepare, just set a schedule and start doing it. Like, I think that's where, he needs to be.
And this is the hilarious point at which I'll tell you to over-prepare everything, because that's just our different personalities. But I think in some ways, yes, definitely think about the release schedule, because, and it's going to take time. And I think the other thing I'd probably recommend is you think about how long this will be. Like, is it 5 minutes? Is it 15 minutes? Is it an hour? Like, whatever it is, can you do that on a consistent basis? Think about when you will be creating that, when you'll be recording that. Make sure you've got the schedule, like you've got time in your schedule to actually do that. Are you going to pre-record some episodes up front? But I guess getting back to your original question, I would introduce yourself. I would let people know what's coming in this podcast, who it's for, what's in it for them. And, think about scheduling things out, even if it's just for the next month. And just let people know, hey, we're going to be talking about Miro, doing Miro boards, or we're going to use Butter or OBS, like whatever it happens to be. Or maybe it's about having fun on camera, like whatever it is. Just let people know, like just signpost what the experience that people are going to have a little bit so they know what to expect. Because they do need to sort of make a choice about whether that content is right for them. I do want to talk about this other question again from Saeed. I know people who record conversations in Zoom and simply publish them one-to-one as audio and video versions. Mm-hmm. They have a large following. I admire this approach of just doing and focusing on the message. Do you want to go first, Sam? I have a lot of feelings about this one.
I feel like this, just doubles down on like, just know what the end product is. Like, this doesn't sound like a podcast anymore. This just sounds like content. And that's fine. If that's what you want to do, great. Just, again, it's just really knowing what that end product is and creating a schedule that you can maintain. As for the actual recording of, interviews via Zoom, I personally would not do that. I would use, if I didn't have this, free gift of StreamYard for the next few months, I would, use video into OBS, or if I'm strictly doing like, audio, I might look at Riverside or one of those other things. Discord is also better than Zoom, in my opinion, as far as audio video sync times and things like that.
Sure. I must admit, as someone who consumes a lot of video and a lot of audio, this kind of gets to me a little bit because I can be a bit of an audio snob. But the thing I've been forced to acknowledge is that I will listen to people talking into a tin can if I'm interested in them and all their subject matter. And it kind of kills me because there are a lot of people that do this professionally that have the worst audio I've ever heard. Like they make me nostalgic for Blog Talk Radio, if any of you even know what that is. Like, it is so bad. And I guess the other thing that I noticed, there are lots of podcast agencies that just have terrible audio. but they have terrible audio while lecturing you on why you should have good audio. And I think, do they not hear what they're producing? Like, is nobody listening to that? And, you know, I try not to lecture people about audio quality, because Lacey's law of audio is basically the minute you start talking about that, your computer will default to something weird. And, you know, we've experienced that on numerous shows.
Yes.
So, but I think the thing that Said's question speaks to, though, is there is definitely a, you know, if you think about it as a continuum, there's caring a lot and caring not at all. And you probably want to be somewhere in the middle. If you care too much, you'll become too perfectionistic. You'll never release anything. And again, in a lot of ways, people are they're lonely, or they're bored, or they want entertainment and connection. And in some ways, prioritizing more content can be more useful than saying, here's your yearly podcast episode with, you know, thousands of hours of editing or whatever. So again, there's definitely a trade-off, and in some ways it's just what works for you. But you know, the great thing about this with any kind of episodic content is that you can change how you do any of this at any time. So it's really up to you. Okay. One last question, because we are running out of time. Is it a good idea to just repurpose a video stream to audio and post it as a podcast?
Yeah. Hey, Jeff. So yeah, we kind of talked about this earlier, and it's really just knowing what the end product is. Like, is it going to be that live stream and then you put all your attention into those aspects? Or is it that audio podcast that you're going to do a lot of post work on? And either way, yes, releasing the audio podcast from that video live stream, I think is good. You just have to know how you're utilizing it with that audience, you know, and making that audio so that you're expressing things in a way that somebody who's listening to it can understand, if you're talking about visual things or if you're showing a tutorial or things like that. And you're just using that as a, here's what you missed, join us live kind of thing. So you make sure you have that information in the description of that podcast as bumpers in the podcast, so that they might turn into those live video watchers at some point as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so this has been the video and live streaming show. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. I know Sam has to run pretty quickly after this, so we'll start wrapping up now. But Sam, if people want to learn more about you and what's your content and connect with you on social, where can they go? Yeah,
head over to samproof.tv and you can find all my social links at the top left there. You find me as Sam Proof on just about anything except TikTok, which may or may not exist by the end of the summer anyway. And if you didn't hear enough about cats this episode, head over to cuteavalanche.com and find our 24/7 kitten cam over there.
Nice. And if you want to catch up with me, head over to johnlacey.com. I've got a whole bunch of articles, and there are social links on the bottom of those pages. So again, thank you for hanging out with us today. Wherever you happen to be watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, or whatever you can do on that particular platform. Next week on the show, we're talking all about vertical streaming. We've had a lot of questions about TikTok and Instagram, so we thought it'd be a good opportunity to come together and explore a few of those. But again, we do kind of want to hear from you if you are looking to start a podcast or a video show or whatever it is. Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear about that. We might even try to keep you a little bit accountable in 2024 as well. So thank you for your company. We'll be back next week. Until then, have a great week.